There are 3 new items in the Horses store. Check them out at horses.land. Thank you. I hope you enjoy this video. These 14 works make up a series called the Black Paintings by the Spanish artist Francisco Goya. They were massive murals depicting horrific scenes of decay, destruction, and suffering. They were painted directly on the walls of the artist's home. Nobody was supposed to see the black paintings. They were never intended for public view. They do not have titles. They were not commissioned by anyone. Goya never spoke or wrote about them. He never told any of his friends or family members about the paintings, and there are virtually no records of their existence from Goya's life. So, why did the artist make them? How did Goya go from painting idyllic works like this to works like this? Why would any individual choose to adorn their walls with paintings of cannibalism, witchcraft, and sorrow? The trajectory of Goya's work follows a well-trodden narrative about an artist descending into madness. But this is, put simply, a poor explanation for the black paintings. The descent into madness tale does not just do a disservice to Goya's paintings, but to art and perhaps even to humanity itself. We will get to that conversation, but for now, let's start with Francisco Goya. Francisco Goya was born in 1746 in Fuentetodos, Spain. Although born into limited means, Goya found immense fame as a painter throughout his life. He was often commissioned by royals for portraiture, and as an artist, Goya was the subject of near universal acclaim. This video is about Goya's black paintings, but to understand these works, we must understand how Goya arrived at them. They were not created in a vacuum, but instead as a reaction to a myriad of circumstances. As wonderfully as things were going within Goya's career, the same could not be said for his country. In 1789, the French Revolution was sending shockwaves into Spain. The Spanish government attempted to stamp out these revolutionary ideas, and the Spanish sympathizers were forced into hiding. Goya himself sided with the left-leaning revolutionaries, but his life materially depended on commissions from the Spanish crown. This crisis of conscience did not create the black paintings, but it is perhaps the very first straw on the camel's back. In 1793, a mysterious disease left Goya completely deaf. Shortly after losing his hearing, Goya underwent an intense depressive episode. His work became darker and more pessimistic, focusing on human suffering and the cruelties of the world. This is captured perfectly in his 1794 painting Yard with Lunatics. In the work, Goya depicts patients in a mental institution. Strikingly, the building seems to be outside. The sun is shining brightly in the entire upper portion of the canvas, and yet the figures are all bathed only in darkness. Externally, the situation in Spain was worsening as well. Ferdinand VII took power, and under his reign, Spain entered into a civil war. Goya attempted to leave the capital city of Madrid on 2 occasions, but was both times threatened with the seizure of his property and the loss of his job. So he stayed in the capital, where he held a unique and bizarre relationship to the conflict. On one hand, he was painting for the new invading king. On the other, Spanish generals invited Goya to document the struggles of their soldiers. All the while, Goya witnessed firsthand the terror of the Civil War. During this time, he produced a series called The Disasters of War, which are a direct precursor to the black paintings. It's hard to say exactly when Goya began Disasters of War, but the earliest entry is dated to 1810. The works are most obviously about the War of Independence, but they are also about war in its totality. Goya's disasters omit references to real people, places, or events, much like his later black paintings. Instead, they portray the everyday sufferings of a population ripped apart by violence. In the series, Goya is not interested in arguments over a just or unjust war. Rather, he seems to portray war as fundamentally wrong. The war is not an error on the part of the Spanish or the invading forces, but error on the part of humanity itself. This philosophy, this pessimistic view of humankind, is the thread which carries Goya through to his black paintings. The horrors of war, the human suffering in his etchings, were not temporary, but rather quite permanent. They became a hinge around which his creative process seemed to turn. With the political situation becoming more oppressive and his health continuing to decline, Goya purchased a house in the countryside. By this time, Goya's creative voice had entirely entered a world of darkness. This would soon culminate in the black paintings. In 1819, Goya fell seriously ill once again. He recovered, but would live the rest of his days in severe mental anguish over a relapse and the looming threat of death. It is likely that after his recovery, Goya began work on the black paintings. These paintings were applied directly to the walls of his home. Modern X-rays have shown that beneath the black paintings there were pleasant murals of nature and country life. It's unclear if Goya painted these murals, but no matter the case, the black paintings represent a deliberate desire to cross out the idyllic with the macabre. These 14 paintings do not depict flesh and blood events. They are not images of things occurring in the world as far as we know. Instead, they are a reflection of mood, of Goya's own internal state of being. Amid the wars, political turmoil, and failing health, the black paintings offer a private glimpse inside the mind of Francisco Goya. Saturn devouring his son is likely the most famous of the black paintings. In subject, it depicts the myth of Kronos, who was later renamed to Saturn by the Romans. In that story, Kronos believes one of his sons will usurp his throne, and so Kronos devours the infant at birth. The narrative is obviously interesting, but it is Goya's depiction which demands attention. Earlier, more traditional depictions of this scene, like this one from Peter Paul Rubens, show Saturn as cruel and malevolent. For a more direct comparison, we can look to an earlier work by Goya himself. Years before creating the black paintings, Goya produced a chalk drawing of Saturn devouring his son. In the drawing, Saturn looks every bit as violent as Rubens, and he is depicted with two bodies, as if his ruthlessness has a procedural quality to it. But in Goya's later painting, it is hard to see any bit of cruelty on Saturn's face. Instead, he looks afraid. Saturn stares at the viewer as if being caught in an act most deplorable. We are afraid of the monster, and the monster is afraid of us. The damage is already done. The figure he holds is bloodied and headless. Saturn, who we would see as the monster, is horrified by himself. The bright lighting puts Saturn in a spotlight against the black background. It feels as if we have interrupted something. But when we examine the tale of Saturn against Goya's work, we find huge inconsistencies. In the story, Saturn is devouring a newborn child. The body being eaten in Goya's painting, though, is quite clearly an adult. The shape of the body could even suggest that it is a woman as well, rather than a son. The Titan Kronos is also representative of time. Perhaps Goya's Saturn is time, the passing of time, and all of mankind's machinations, devouring humanity itself. But the painting lacks the typical iconography that would be associated with Saturn. Constellations, hourglasses, and scythes are conspicuously absent. Artists are inclined to take creative liberties, certainly. But one possible explanation for these inconsistencies is also that the painting does not depict Saturn. Goya did not title the painting. Historians today have given it that title and anointed it that subject matter, but this is just a theory. It's quite possible that Goya did not paint Saturn. So, what did he paint? Goya and his wife had between 5 and 20 children. No one really knows the exact number, but only one survived beyond childhood, their son Javier. From Javier's earliest days, Goya doted over the boy. Goya wrote poetic letters to his friends about his son. When his wife died, Goya gave virtually all of his belongings and paintings to Javier. After Javier married into a wealthy family, Goya still took financial responsibility for the child. Nearing the end of his life, Goya was spending all of his money on his son. The father had grand hopes that Javier would devote himself to art, but that did not happen. When we look at a portrait of the 21-year-old Javier done by Goya, we perhaps see how Goya viewed his child. The boy is handsome, but he is childlike, pretty, and his expression is even aloof. The painting does not render Javier as strong or determined, but instead as a well-to-do, unconcerned youth. Perhaps Saturn is a reflection of Goya's own strained, disappointing relationship with his son, or an allegory for the children Goya lost. But I think to prescribe such specific meaning to works of art is often a misled endeavor, and as we continue to look at the black paintings, this does become a good thesis on the works. Witches' Sabbath is another iconic painting from the period. In the work, a goat, likely Satan, presides over a coven of witches who look horrified and distraught at the scene. The shortest of the witches, sitting next to Satan, has been suggested to be a child or an infant being prepared for some kind of ritual. The witches are painted in unflattering forms. They are grotesque and twisted in their renderings. Still, though, the painting offers very little in the way of outright condemnation of witchcraft specifically. Instead, it just shows some ritual as Goya would have imagined it. The setting is vague at very best. It seems clear that the events are occurring outside, but the viewer knows little more than that. This was not the first time Goya painted witchcraft. His arguably more famous work from several years prior shows a similar scene. He depicted witches in a few other works. Goya was a staunch liberal, and he fiercely opposed the work of the Spanish Inquisition. His paintings of witches are generally accepted as silent protests to the Inquisition. This one is no exception. In another famous piece from the black paintings, Goya's subject matter shifts from the cosmic and mythical to the mundane and even crass. Two women and a man seems to depict a man masturbating to the mockery or humor of two peasant women. Just like in Saturn and Sabbath, the painting is set against an ambiguous black background. The scene could be playing out anywhere at all. Goya has disfigured all of the faces. Whether they are jovial, embarrassed, or something else entirely, they have become grotesque and horrific depictions of human emotion. There is also two friars, which seems to depict a monk alongside some vaguely bestial figure. While the bearded figure looks contemplative and receptive in the painting as it exists today, this is a result of changes during the restoration process. In early photos of the paintings on Goya's walls, the bearded man seems dark, brooding, and even standoffish. The whispering figure has been better preserved. He barely looks human. Some historians have suggested him as a metaphor for time or death itself. One of the most mysterious paintings of the series is Two Old People Eating. Historians do not know where this was painted in the home, nor do they entirely understand what is going on in the painting. The work shows two figures, one holding a spoon who seems to be a woman. She is grinning widely, though her smile does not look particularly amicable. The other figure looks on, if he is even alive at all. Here we have what would be a charming domestic scene, two elderly people having dinner, morphed into the grotesque. What is this lady pointing at? Why is she smiling if she is accompanied by a dead body or a dying man? This work reflects Goya's tendency with the black paintings. Where many artists look for the beautiful in the commonplace, Goya seemed obsessed with finding darkness in everyday minutiae. The pilgrimage to San Isidro is particularly compelling. It shows a scene that Goya had already painted once in his life, but his previous depiction of San Isidro offered bright colors, beautiful fashions, and a sense of serenity. There is anything but serenity in this one, however. Historians believe the painting depicts a festival called Saturnalia. This festival, though, is a merry, bright occasion. Goya has instead given it a characteristic, unrelenting bleakness. The figures in this painting do not show celebration, but instead immense despair and distress. Within Atropos, Goya returns to the heavenly. This painting depicts the three fates, Clotho, Lachesis, and Atropos. These divine figures are daughters of the night, said to grant man access to good and evil. But Goya has not painted them with the reverence traditionally given towards the gods. They are gnarled and disfigured as they carry away a fourth body through the sky. Certainly the most heartbreaking of the black paintings is the drowning dog. Again, only titled so much after Goya's death. In fact, this particular painting has been assigned a number of titles. These include the dog, head of a dog, the buried dog, the half-drowned dog, and the half-submerged dog. I personally find this painting to be immensely distressing. The more we stare at the scene, the harder it becomes to look. Many art historians have taken the work as depicting a losing battle, the dog against this sloped, large, dark mass. The dog is perhaps human, futile, posed against humanity, the individual defeated by the world. I think of this painting as a thesis statement for the black paintings. Goya is the dog, isolated and nearing the end of his life and defeated by forces far, far outside of his control. Death was coming. Goya knew this, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. The forces of the world, the slopes, were unrelentingly pushing into him. He was drowning. Although it is tempting to force blunt interpretations onto these or any paintings, the works are mysterious and vague. The black paintings may not be one-to-one depictions of scenes, scenarios, or stories. They are instead reflective of Goya's spirit. Likewise, examining these paintings is more an act of the soul than one of the mind. So perhaps we should turn to Goya's soul for our closest approximation at understanding his work. The most blunt and shallow assessment of Goya weaves tales of a descent into madness. But look at what this artist has given humanity. Certainly Goya deserves a more nuanced conversation. Certainly he deserves some empathy. For this conversation, we can look to factors both external and internal. Ferdinand VII, the ruling monarch in Spain, would be a good place to start. Often called Spain's worst king, Ferdinand was a short-sighted tyrant who lacked courage, constitution, and competence. His reign was marked by oppression, specifically the oppression of ideas which Goya himself held dear to his heart. Ferdinand had no interest in the well-being of his people. His court was rife with corruption, and the king dreadfully mismanaged Spain's overseas colonies. As we already mentioned, Ferdinand ultimately plunged Spain into civil war. Even if Goya could have shut out political turmoil from his mind, he would not have found a safe place to retreat. Goya was never in great health, mentally or physically. Most specifically, we can point to 4 distinct episodes of illness in 1777, 1787, 1819, and 1828. All of these incidents have been the subject of a wide range of speculation without any definite conclusions. Goya's symptoms throughout his life were remarkably disparate. The artist was plagued with temporary paralysis, partial blindness, depression, nausea, dizziness, pain, and a general sense of sorrow. Amid the varying diagnoses historians have offered for Goya, Laura L. Casey points to Occam's razor in her paper Goya in Sickness and in Health. She argues that we should accept the most obvious and most simple explanation. All of these symptoms, with the sole exception of his deafness, are characteristic of somatic depression. That is, depression which affects the body instead of only the mind. In one famous etching, entitled The Sleep of Reason Produces Monsters, we can find some evidence for Casey's conclusion. The work shows a figure, often believed to be Goya himself, plagued by beasts and demons as he leans onto a table, his hands attempting to shield himself from these torments. The work is likely an allegory for Spanish society at the time, but Goya's life also provides a number of incidents that could certainly catapult the individual towards severe depression. In 1773, Goya married Maria Josefa, who was well connected to the royal family. Goya knew that he had political views the royals would see as troublesome, but he also had no interest in abdicating his opinions. So today, historians believe his marriage carried ulterior motives. By having the support of a well-to-do family, Goya could paint and express his feelings without the immediate danger of retribution. Of course, such a marriage would create tension. Indeed, Goya and his wife had a lifelong relationship which was decidedly unhappy. To compound this issue, Goya and his wife buried all but one of their children. If the low estimates are true, Goya would have seen 4 of his children die. On the high end, as many as 19. While Goya eventually arrived at a place of critical acclaim, this was not always the case. His early entries into the Spanish art world were met with rejection after rejection. The eventual arrival of Ferdinand VII would have also pushed the liberal Goya into disfavor, even if the king did not outwardly force any consequences on the artist. All of these things were happening against a backdrop of devastating civil war. Civil war which was plaguing Goya's backyard, his day-to-day life. These troubles would be enough to affect any given individual, surely, but as Casey points out in her paper, an artist like Goya would have been uniquely sensitive to this turmoil. It is a safe generalization to say that artists are more susceptible to mood disorders than other members of the population. Certainly the degree to which this is true ranges widely on a case-by-case basis. Artists are not always troubled, and troubled people are not always artists. But as it so often happens, trouble and talent worked in tandem for Francisco Goya. Goya displayed an inherent and lifelong propensity towards heightened sensitivity. This enriched Goya's abilities as an artist, surely. Gifted with a greater awareness of his general environment and his own mind, Goya was inherently better equipped to portray these landscapes, both mental and physical. He could see colors of humanity that many of us cannot, but this talent was not always to his well-being. When Goya saw pain, he felt it magnified. When he experienced pain, it fractured him. Goya's contemporaries recall that the artist regularly experienced bouts of violent outrage after seeing injustices, suffering, and cruelties. After his 1819 illness, Goya produced a painting called Self-Portrait with Dr. Arrieta. This work shows his doctor holding Goya and offering him a tonic. The doctor here feels more like a priest offering Goya his last rites. While the painting was produced in a sort of thankful gesture, Goya long held disdain for medical professionals within Spain, and this was well justified. During Goya's life, there was a tradition of calling physicians matasanos, which translates loosely to killers of the healthy. Surgery in Spain took a form that basically resembled bloodletting. The Spanish Inquisition was also happening during Goya's life. Within this context, physical maladies were caused not by physical conditions, but instead by spiritual, faith-based issues. Any physician who divorced the physical from the metaphysical would have been essentially laughed out of their position. And so towards the end of his days, Goya's life was in the hands of a system which he hated and which he rightfully saw as corrupt and misled. Consider this alongside a life which was marked by physical health crises. With unending threats to his life and a medical system which seemed entirely incompetent, Goya's later years were marked by the looming threat of death. He seemed certain that he would die, if not Tuesday, then Wednesday, if not Wednesday, then Thursday, that he had outlived his own life and that death would soon come to collect. When we consider these things, it is not just Goya's art that we unlock, but art itself and even humanity. At its very best, art is a direct communication from the soul. It defies clumsy explanations. Goya's black paintings are perhaps the pinnacle of this. We have no insight from the artist on the paintings. They do not depict events which we can look to. The material substance of the work is equally elusive. They are in horrible condition and have been editorialized almost shamelessly in places. The black paintings defy mechanical explanation. They always will. With this in mind, it is very tempting to say that Goya just went mad in his countryside estate. But this is incorrect. It is dismissive, and for that it is a cruel thing to say. When I was a child, I used to watch my grandfather build model airplanes. These planes were the result of great care and labor and consideration, and he used fine instruments and delicate tools to put them together. Often when we classify people as crazy, we are just throwing parts into a pile and saying we've built an airplane. We fail to realize that individual pieces have significance. This plank is a wing, this glass is a cockpit, this plastic is the propeller. If we choose to neglect these significances and choose to think without care, certainly that is a fault of our own rather than of the model itself. So too are the feelings and experiences of the individual. Francisco Goya was a strong man, sensitive and strong. Goya absorbed events in the world around him. He felt pain, and he acted in a way that was honest to himself. Our inability to build this airplane, our inability to empathize, does not make Francisco Goya a crazy person. His legacy should not be embellished by romantic, vague notions of an artist driven to madness. Instead, Goya and his work exist as profound reflections of the human condition, both internal and external. This is a gift he has given us, and one that we would do well to repay.